I stood frozen in my study, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the lace curtains my late husband had helped me hang 30 years ago. In my weathered hands, I clutched a manila envelope that contained everything: my sanity, my future, my very identity. With trembling fingers, I broke the hospital seal and pulled out the official letterhead of the Riverside Medical Institute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 words leaped from the page in stark, professional typeface. Cognitively fully intact. Those 3 simple words shattered 8 months of carefully constructed lies. 8 months of being told I was losing my mind. 8 months of watching my eldest son, Marcus, convince everyone, my neighbors, my friends, even my own daughter, that I was slipping into the dark fog of dementia. 8 months of doubting. Every memory, every decision, every coherent thought I believed I still possessed. But here it was, printed on official medical letterhead with Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield's signature at the bottom. Margaret Catherine Whitmore, age 71, shows no signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or any form of mental impairment. Her memory, reasoning abilities, and executive functions all test within superior ranges for her age group. My name is Margaret Whitmore, though everyone in Millbrook Springs calls me Maggie. I'm 71 years old, a retired high school English teacher, who spent 43 years shaping young minds. Until last autumn, I thought I understood the depths of human cruelty. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we dive into this nightmare, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. It means the world to know this story is reaching people everywhere. And if what I'm about to share resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tomorrow, I have something incredibly important to share about protecting yourself and your loved ones from exactly what happened to me. The weight of that medical report in my hands felt heavier than any textbook I'd ever carried into a classroom. For 8 torturous months, I had been living in a manufactured reality where my own son systematically dismantled my sense of self, piece by calculated piece, where Marcus Whitmore, the baby I had nursed through pneumonia, the boy I had cheered at every baseball game, the young man I had put through law school, had decided that stealing my life's work was worth convincing the world that his mother had lost her mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who had spent decades teaching students to analyze literature, to recognize themes of betrayal and manipulation in the great works of fiction, yet I had been blind to the most devastating plot twist in my own life story. Sank into the leather armchair that had been my reading sanctuary for over 2 decades, the medical report still trembling in my grasp. Around me, the study that Marcus had tried to present as evidence of my confusion looked exactly as it always had: organized, purposeful, lived in. The built-in bookshelves lined with my collection of classic literature, the mahogany desk where I had graded thousands of essays, the framed photographs of my family spanning 50 years of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. This room, this house, everything I had built with my late husband Robert, it had all been under siege. Not from age, not from illness, not from the natural decline that might come with advancing years, but from calculated greed disguised as filial concern. The truly diabolical part of Marcus's plan wasn't just the financial manipulation, though heaven knows he had been thorough in that regard. It was the way he had made me complicit in my own destruction. Every time I questioned a forgotten conversation, every moment I searched frantically for misplaced keys that he had hidden, every instance when I couldn't find important documents that had mysteriously vanished from their usual spots, I had begun to doubt myself. He had weaponized my love for him against me. Used my natural inclination to trust my own child as the very tool to dismantle my confidence in my own mind. When someone you raised from infancy looks you in the eye and says with apparent concern, "Mom, you told me this same story yesterday," And the day before that? You begin to wonder if perhaps your memory isn't as reliable as you thought. But it wasn't just my memory Marcus had attacked. He had systematically isolated me from my support network, painting himself as the devoted son, sacrificing his own life to care for his declining mother. He had convinced my book club that I was becoming difficult. He had told my longtime neighbors that I was having episodes. He had even reached out to my former colleagues at Millbrook High, expressing his concern about my confusion and asking them to keep an eye on me when I visited the school. Most devastatingly, he had nearly convinced my daughter, Patricia, that intervention was necessary. That legal guardianship might be the kindest option. That selling the family home and moving me into supervised care was the loving thing to do. The house that Robert and I had scrimped and saved to buy as newlyweds. The house where we had raised our children, where I had recovered from Robert's death, where I had planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by 6 decades of memories. Marcus had been systematically preparing to strip it all away, convincing everyone that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. As I sat there holding the proof of my mental competence, I realized that this medical report wasn't just vindication, it was a weapon. For months, I had felt like a character in one of the Gothic novels I used to teach, trapped in a maze of psychological manipulation with no way to prove my sanity to a world that had already decided I was losing it. Now I had my proof. Now I had my voice back. Now I had the power to expose exactly what my son had tried to do to me and why. But the hardest part wasn't behind me. It was ahead. Because now I had to decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. How do you confront the child you love with evidence of their betrayal? How do you rebuild trust with family and friends who had been so easily convinced of your incompetence? How do you reclaim a life that someone tried to steal from you one manipulated moment at a time? The medical report in my hands held more than just test results and professional opinions. It held the key to everything I had almost lost: my independence, my dignity, my future, and most importantly, my truth. What Marcus hadn't counted on was that his mother, the same woman who had taught thousands of students to think critically, to question narratives, to seek evidence, would eventually turn those same skills on her own life. He had underestimated the very intellect he was trying to discredit. This is the story of how I fought back, how I reclaimed my life from someone who should have been protecting it, and how one doctor's report changed everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Millbrook Springs like a gentle embrace, just as it had every autumn for the 34 years I'd called this place home. From my kitchen window, I could see the town's historic clock tower rising above the maple trees that lined Harmony Street, their leaves painted in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. This was my sanctuary, my corner of the world where everything made sense and followed the comforting rhythms I had carefully cultivated over decades. My Victorian cottage sat on 2 acres of carefully tended gardens, a testament to the life Robert and I had built together from nothing. We'd purchased this property in 1989, when it was little more than a rundown farmhouse with good bones and endless potential. Robert had been a master carpenter, and together we had transformed it into something magical. Wraparound porches with intricate gingerbread trim, restored hardwood floors that gleamed like honey in the morning light, and gardens that bloomed in careful succession from early spring through late fall. I was Margaret Catherine Whitmore, though everyone in town knew me simply as Mrs. Whitmore, or, to my former students and closest friends, Maggie. At 71, I was the retired head of the English department at Millbrook High School, where I had spent 43 years nurturing young minds and watching 3 generations of families pass through my classroom. Teaching had never felt like work. To me, it was a calling, a privilege to help shape the way young people thought about literature, language, and life itself. The house reflected my educator's soul. Every room told a story. The front parlor, which I had converted into a library, housed over 3,000 books collected throughout my career. First editions of Dickens and Austen sat alongside contemporary works by authors I had discovered at teaching conferences. Student thank-you letters from decades past filled a special drawer in my desk, testimonials to the impact a dedicated teacher could have on young lives. My daily routine was as precisely orchestrated as a symphony. Each morning at 6:30, I would brew a pot of Earl Grey tea and settle into the sunroom with the Millbrook Gazette and the state newspaper. By 8 I would be in my gardens, tending to whatever season demanded, pruning roses in late winter, planting annuals in spring, deadheading perennials in summer, or preparing beds for winter as autumn progressed. Tuesday afternoons belonged to the Millbrook Literary Society, a book club I had founded 20 years earlier that now boasted 37 members. We met in the community center, discussing everything from classic literature to contemporary, bestsellers, our conversations often spilling over into dinner at Rosemary's Cafe afterward. Thursday mornings were reserved for volunteer work at the town library, where I helped organize reading programs for children and managed the rare books collection. Financially, I was more secure than many retirees. Robert's life insurance policy, combined with my teacher's pension and the wise investments we had made together, provided a comfortable lifestyle. The house was paid off, my medical expenses were covered by excellent insurance, and I had accumulated substantial savings over the years. Robert and I had been frugal by nature, preferring to invest in experiences and education rather than material luxuries. Though we had splurged on a few meaningful items, the baby grand piano in the living room, the greenhouse Robert had built for my orchids, and the collection of first edition teaching materials that filled my study. My social circle was rich and varied. There was Eleanor Hutchinson, my walking partner who lived 3 houses down, with whom I maintained a daily 2-mile circuit around the neighborhood. Dr. James Morrison, our family physician for over 20 years, was also a close friend who shared my passion for Victorian literature. Pastor Samuel Wright from First Methodist had become a confidant after Robert's death, helping me navigate the complex emotions of widowhood. Perhaps most importantly, there was my weekly phone call with my sister Dorothy in Seattle, a tradition we had maintained for 15 years. Dorothy was 2 years younger, but had always been my closest advisor, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world. These Sunday evening conversations were sacred to me, covering everything from family news to philosophical discussions about aging, purpose, and the meaning of a life well lived. My relationship with my children had always been a source of pride. Patricia, my younger child at 45, was a pediatric nurse in Richmond who visited monthly with her twin boys, bringing laughter and chaos to my orderly world. She had inherited my love of books and often called seeking recommendations for her hospital's patient library. Marcus, 3 years older than Patricia, was a successful attorney in the state capitol who had built an impressive practice in estate law and financial planning. Both children had thrived academically, encouraged by parents who valued education above all else. Marcus had graduated summa cum laude from the State University before earning his law degree. Patricia had followed a more practical path through nursing school, but had later completed her master's degree while raising her sons. I had supported both of them financially through their education, proud to invest in their futures the way my own parents had invested in mine. The house itself was my greatest achievement and my most tangible legacy. Every room reflected choices Robert and I had made together. The kitchen, renovated just 5 years before his death, featured custom cabinets he had built and granite countertops we had selected together on a memorable weekend trip to the quarries. The master bedroom overlooked the rose garden I had planted. To commemorate our 25th wedding anniversary, guest rooms were maintained in perfect condition for family visits, decorated with quilts I had sewn and furniture Robert had restored. My independence was perhaps my most cherished possession. At 71, I still drove confidently around town and to neighboring cities. I managed all my own finances, paid my bills online, and kept meticulous records of every transaction. I maintained the house with help from local contractors for major projects, but handled most day-to-day maintenance myself. I cooked elaborate meals for myself and guests, maintained an active correspondence with former students and colleagues, and had even begun writing what I hoped might become a memoir about my teaching years. My health was excellent for my age. Annual checkups with Dr. Morrison consistently showed normal blood pressure, healthy cholesterol levels, and no signs of the chronic conditions that plagued many of my contemporaries. I took a daily multivitamin and a low-dose aspirin, but no prescription medications. My mind remained sharp. I could recite lengthy passages from Shakespeare, remember the names and stories of hundreds of former students, and engage in complex discussions about literature, politics, and current events. This was my world in the eye. Autumn of my 71st year, ordered, purposeful, rich with relationships and meaningful activities. I had plans for the future, a trip to England the following spring to visit places featured in the novels I had taught for decades, a writing project about innovative teaching methods, and the possibility of auditing some literature courses at the nearby college. I felt blessed beyond measure. Robert and I had created something beautiful together, and I was successfully maintaining and building upon that foundation in my widowhood. My children were thriving, my grandchildren were healthy and happy, and I was contributing meaningfully to my community while pursuing interests that brought me joy. I had no way of knowing that this carefully constructed life, this sanctuary I had spent decades building, was about to come under attack from the last person I would ever have suspected. The storm clouds gathering on my horizon were invisible to me, disguised as concern from someone I trusted completely. Everything was about to change, and the source of that change would be the one person who should have been protecting what I had built, my own son. The first signs of autumn were painting the maples along Harmony Street when Marcus called with news that would forever alter the trajectory of my peaceful life. His voice carried an unusual heaviness when he phoned that Tuesday evening in late September, interrupting my usual routine of grading papers for the literacy program I had recently joined as a volunteer tutor. "Mom, I have something difficult to tell you," he began, his tone more formal than our typical conversations. "Jessica filed for divorce yesterday. The news hit me like a physical blow." Marcus and Jessica had been married for 12 years, and while I had sensed some tension during recent family gatherings, I had attributed it to the normal stresses of busy careers and raising two teenagers. Jessica was a successful real estate agent, and together they had built what appeared to be an enviable life in Riverside Heights, the affluent suburb where Marcus had established his law practice. "Oh, sweetheart," I breathed, setting down my red pen and giving him my full attention. "What happened?" The story that emerged over the next hour was both heartbreaking and shocking. According to Marcus, Jessica had been having an affair with a colleague for over 2 years. She was demanding half of everything they had built together, including the equity in their custom-built home, Marcus's retirement accounts, and even a portion of his law practice. Most devastating of all, she was seeking primary custody of their children, 16-year-old Emma and 14-year-old Tyler, despite Marcus being the more present parent throughout their marriage. "She's claiming I'm a workaholic who neglected the family," Marcus explained, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's painting me as this absent father who cared more about billable hours than bedtime stories. It's completely unfair, Mom. You know how much those kids mean to me." I did know. Marcus had always been a devoted father, coaching Tyler's little league teams and never missing Emma's dance recitals despite his demanding schedule. He had often brought the children to visit me, and I had witnessed firsthand his patience and involvement in their lives. The injustice of Jessica's accusations made my heart ache for him. "The financial implications are staggering," he continued. "My attorney says I could lose 60% of everything I've worked for. The alimony alone could bankrupt me. And with Jessica's family connections in the legal community, she's hired one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state. As a mother, my first instinct was to offer whatever support I could. "What can I do to help?" I asked immediately. "Do you need financial assistance for legal fees? You know your father and I always intended for our savings to help our children when they needed it most." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Actually, Mom, there is something, but I hate to ask, and I want you to think carefully before answering." "Tell me what you need." "I was wondering if I could come stay with you for a while, just temporarily, until this legal nightmare sorts itself out. Jessica's attorney has already filed motions to freeze some of our joint accounts, and she's making it impossible for me to remain in the house. Every conversation turns into a screaming match, and it's destroying the kids to witness it." My heart immediately opened to his request. The thought of my son struggling through this crisis alone was unbearable. "Of course you can stay here," I said without hesitation. "This is your home too, Marcus. It always will be." "Are you sure? I know you value your independence, and I don't want to disrupt your routine. It would probably be for several months, maybe longer depending on how the proceedings go." "Nonsense," I replied firmly. "Family takes care of family. You can have the blue guest room upstairs, or if you need more space for work, we could set up the sunroom as a temporary office." When Marcus arrived the following weekend with his BMW loaded with suitcases, boxes of legal documents, and his laptop equipment, I was struck by how diminished he appeared. This successful attorney, who had always carried himself with confidence and purpose, now looked haggard and defeated. His usual designer suits had been replaced with wrinkled khakis and polo shirts. Dark circles under his eyes spoke to sleepless nights spent worrying about his future. I immediately set about making him comfortable, preparing his favorite foods and ensuring he had everything he needed to work from the house. I cleared out the sunroom and helped him set up a makeshift office where he could take client calls and work on cases. When he mentioned that the stress was affecting his sleep, I suggested he take the master bedroom instead of the smaller guest room. "Mom, I couldn't possibly take your bedroom," he protested, though I noticed his eyes linger on the spacious room with its king-size bed and attached private bathroom. "It's much more practical," I insisted. "You'll need the space for all your work materials, and the bathroom is larger. I'll be perfectly comfortable in the blue room. It's only temporary anyway." Within days, Marcus had effectively taken over the master suite, transforming it into a combination bedroom and secondary office. His law books filled the built-in shelves where Robert's woodworking magazines used to sit. His expensive suits hung in the walk-in closet where my dresses had resided for over 3 decades. The bathroom counter was covered with his toiletries and prescription medications. I told myself it was a small sacrifice to help my son through his crisis. After all, he was clearly suffering, working 18-hour days to maintain his client base while simultaneously dealing with the emotional and financial devastation of his divorce. He had lost weight and developed a persistent cough that he attributed to stress. Some evenings, I would hear him on long phone calls with his attorney, his voice tight with frustration as they discussed strategy and financial projections. "The whole system is rigged against men," he would tell me over dinner, pushing food around his plate without much appetite. "Jessica can make any accusation she wants, and the courts automatically believe her. Meanwhile, I'm working myself to death trying to keep the practice afloat and pay for legal fees that increase every week." My maternal instincts were in full protective mode. This was my child in pain, and every fiber of my being wanted to ease his suffering. When he mentioned that the stress was affecting his ability to focus on his cases, I began taking over more of the household responsibilities to give him space to concentrate. I cooked elaborate meals, hoping to tempt his appetite. I handled all the cleaning and laundry, including his expensive suits that required special care. "You're too good to me, Mom," he would say, seeming genuinely grateful. "I don't know what I would do without you right now. You're literally saving my life." Those Words meant everything to me. After years of feeling somewhat peripheral to my adult children's busy lives, it was deeply satisfying to feel needed again, to know that my presence was making a meaningful difference during his darkest hour. Looking back now, I can see that this was when everything began to shift, though the changes were so gradual and seemed so reasonable given the circumstances that I didn't recognize them as warning signs. Marcus was simply a son in crisis, and I was simply a mother doing what mothers do, providing unconditional love and support when their children need it most. What I didn't realize was that I was being carefully studied, my routines observed, my vulnerabilities cataloged. The grateful, defeated man sharing my home was already beginning to plan something far more sinister than recovering from a difficult divorce. The first phase of his campaign was complete. He had gained access to my sanctuary, my trust, and my sympathy. Now he could begin the real work of convincing everyone, including me, that the competent, independent woman who had welcomed him home was slowly disappearing into confusion and decline. But that revelation was still months away. For now, I was simply a mother helping her child, proud of my ability to provide comfort during his time of need, completely unaware that my own world was about to be systematically dismantled by the person I was trying so hard to protect. The changes began so subtly that I initially dismissed them as the natural adjustments that come with sharing a home after years of living alone. Marcus had been staying with me for 3 weeks when I first noticed the small inconsistencies that would eventually grow into something much more sinister. It started with conversations. I would mention something to Marcus over breakfast, perhaps a phone call I'd received from Patricia or a decision about the garden preparations for winter, only to have him reference it later, as if I had told him something entirely different. "Mom, about that conversation we had this morning regarding Patricia's visit," he said one evening as I was preparing dinner. "I think it's wise that you're reconsidering having the boys stay here. 2 energetic 12-year-olds might be overwhelming. For you right now." I paused in my chopping of vegetables for the roast, confused. "I never said anything about reconsidering. I'm looking forward to their visit next month. I've already planned activities and cleared my schedule." Marcus's expression shifted to one of gentle concern, the same look I had seen him use with difficult clients when he needed to deliver unwelcome news. "Mom, we definitely discussed this. You mentioned feeling tired lately and wondering if hosting them might be too much. You even said you were worried about keeping up with their energy levels." The certainty in his voice made me question my own recollection. Had I expressed doubts about Patricia's visit? I had been feeling slightly more fatigued recently, though I attributed that to the adjustment of having someone else in the house and the extra cooking and cleaning involved. But I distinctly remembered looking forward to seeing my grandsons, not dreading it. "I suppose I might have mentioned being tired," I said carefully, "but I don't recall saying anything about canceling their visit." "Not canceling," Marcus corrected, gently. "Just postponing until you're feeling more like yourself. Maybe after the holidays when things are less hectic." I stood there holding my paring knife, struggling with a growing sense of confusion. Marcus seemed so certain of what I had said, yet it contradicted my clear memory of being excited about the upcoming visit. Was it possible that I had expressed reservations without fully registering them? The uncertainty was deeply unsettling. Similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. I would mention plans to attend book club, only to have Marcus remind me later that I had decided to skip it because I wasn't feeling well. I would discuss my intention to plant tulip bulbs in a particular section of the garden, then find myself being gently corrected that I had actually decided against it because the location wouldn't provide adequate drainage. Each time, Marcus's tone was patient and concerned, never condescending or argumentative. He would simply state his version of our conversations with such confidence that I began to doubt my own recall. The self-assurance that had always been one of his most attractive qualities as an attorney was now being turned on me in ways that, left me feeling uncertain and confused. The incidents escalated beyond conversations into actions and routines that had been second nature to me for decades. One morning, I went to take my daily vitamin supplement and found the bottle missing from its usual spot on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. "Marcus, have you seen my vitamins?" I called out to him as he sat in the dining room with his laptop and legal papers spread across the table that had hosted countless family meals. "You took them already, Mom," he replied without looking up from his screen. "About an hour ago, when you had your first cup of coffee." I stared at the empty spot where the bottle should have been, trying to reconstruct my morning routine. I clearly remembered making coffee and settling into the sunroom with the newspaper, but I had no recollection of taking my vitamin. This wasn't like forgetting whether I had locked the front door. This was a daily ritual I had performed without fail for over 15 years. "Are you sure?" I asked, walking to the dining room. "I don't remember taking it." Marcus finally looked up, his expression shifting to that same gentle concern that was becoming disturbingly familiar. "Mom, you definitely took it. You even commented that the new bottle seems to have a different smell than the last one." The specificity of his recollection was convincing, yet I felt absolutely certain that I hadn't taken my vitamin that morning. I spent the next 10 minutes searching for the bottle, eventually finding it in the pantry behind a box of cereal. When I asked Marcus how it might have ended up there, he suggested that I had probably put it there myself while getting breakfast items and simply forgotten. The explanation seemed reasonable, yet something about the entire incident felt wrong. I had never stored vitamins in the pantry, and I couldn't imagine any scenario where I would have placed the bottle in that location. But Marcus's certainty, combined with the physical evidence of the misplaced bottle, made it difficult to maintain confidence in my own version of events. I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down daily activities and conversations in an attempt to maintain some reliable record of my own experiences. It was a practical solution that helped ease my growing anxiety about these memory lapses, or what Marcus had begun referring to as my little episodes. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Mom," he assured me one evening after I had spent 20 minutes looking for my reading glasses, which I eventually found in the kitchen, despite being certain I had left them beside my chair in the living room. "Memory changes are completely normal at your age. The important thing is that you're aware of it and taking steps to compensate." His understanding and support should have been comforting, but instead, it filled me with a cold dread that I couldn't quite explain. The loving son who was helping me cope with my apparent cognitive decline was the same person who seemed to be the only witness to most of these incidents. When these episodes occurred in his absence, I functioned perfectly normally. It was only when Marcus was present that I seemed to lose track of conversations, misplace items, or forget actions I had supposedly taken. The most disturbing incident occurred on a Thursday morning when I was preparing to leave for my volunteer shift at the library. I had laid out my clothes the night before, as was my habit, and had placed my car keys on the hall table beside my purse. But when I went to collect them, both the keys and my purse were missing. After searching the house for 30 minutes, growing increasingly frustrated and confused, I finally asked Marcus for help. He found both items in my bedroom closet, tucked behind some winter coats that I rarely accessed. "Mom, this is really concerning," he said, holding my purse and keys with an expression of deep worry. "Do you remember putting these in the closet?" I didn't. I had absolutely no recollection of moving either item from their proper location to that odd hiding spot. The discovery filled me with a terror that went beyond simple embarrassment or frustration. If I was capable of performing actions that I couldn't remember, what else might I be doing without awareness? "Maybe I should call Dr. Morrison," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "This isn't normal." "I think that's a very wise idea," Marcus agreed. "In fact, I've been doing some research about memory issues, and there are some excellent specialists who might be able to help. But for now, maybe you should consider whether it's safe for you to drive to the library alone." the suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Driving represented my independence, my ability to maintain the social connections and volunteer commitments that gave my life meaning. The thought of being confined to the house, dependent on others for transportation, was almost unbearable. "Feel perfectly capable of driving," I protested. "I'm sure you do," Marcus replied gently. "But what if you have one of these episodes while you're out? What if you forget where you've parked, or can't remember how to get home? I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." His concern seemed genuine and reasonable, yet accepting his suggestion felt like surrendering a crucial piece of my identity. I compromised by agreeing to call Eleanor and ask her to accompany me to the library, framing it as a social visit rather than a safety measure. That evening, as I sat in my notebook recording the day's events, I noticed that my handwriting looked shaky and uncertain. Even my penmanship, which had always been neat and controlled from years of writing on blackboards, seemed to be deteriorating along with everything else. I closed the notebook and stared out at my garden, where the autumn flowers were beginning, their final display before winter's arrival. Everything I looked at seemed to remind me of tasks I needed to complete, decisions I needed to make, responsibilities I might no longer be capable of handling properly. Marcus was right to be concerned. Something was definitely happening to me, some subtle erosion of the mental faculties I had always taken for granted. The loving attention he was providing, his willingness to help me navigate these increasingly frequent episodes, should have been a source of comfort. Instead, it felt like I was slowly drowning in quicksand, and the harder I struggled to maintain my independence and confidence, the faster I seemed to sink into confusion and self-doubt. What I didn't yet realize was that the quicksand wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was being carefully constructed around me, one grain at a time, by someone who understood exactly how to make me doubt my own mind while positioning himself as my only reliable guide through the growing chaos. The transformation of my social world began with such careful orchestration that I almost admired Marcus's legal mind, even as it was being used to dismantle my life piece by systematic piece. What had started as private moments of confusion between us gradually expanded into public demonstrations of my supposed decline, witnessed by the very people whose opinions mattered most to me in Millbrook Springs. It was during the monthly meeting of the Millbrook Literary Society that Marcus first made his concerns about me public. I had been looking forward to our discussion of Margaret Atwood's latest novel for weeks, having prepared extensive notes and marked passages I wanted to share with the group. The meeting was held at the community center, the same venue where I had facilitated countless discussions over the past 20 years. I arrived precisely on time, as was my habit, carrying my well-worn copy of the book and a thermos of tea. The familiar faces of my literary companions greeted me warmly. Helen Cartwright, who had been coming to book club for 15 years. Sarah Beth Williams, a retired librarian who shared my passion for Victorian literature, and Dorothy May Collins, whose sharp wit always added spark to our discussions. We had settled into our usual circle of chairs when Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic and slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," he said, addressing the group with the same professional courtesy he used in his law practice. "I was hoping to catch my mother before the meeting started." All eyes turned to me as I looked up in surprise. "Marcus, what are you doing here? Is everything all right?" He approached with that now familiar expression of gentle concern. "Mom, you forgot your medication again this morning. I noticed the pills are still in the kitchen counter when I went to make coffee." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. I felt heat rise to my cheeks as I became aware of 15 pairs of eyes watching this exchange with growing interest. "I don't take any medication," I said quietly, confusion evident in my voice. Marcus's expression grew more troubled. "Mom, Dr. Morrison prescribed them for you last week. The small white pills you're supposed to take with breakfast? You were worried about forgetting them, so we put them right beside the coffee maker." I stared at him, completely bewildered. I had no memory of visiting Dr. Morrison recently, no recollection of any prescription, and certainly no awareness of any medication routine. Yet Marcus spoke with such certainty, such specific detail, that doubt began creeping into my mind, even as I felt absolutely sure he was mistaken. "Perhaps I should take you home so you can take them now," he continued, his voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear clearly. "I know how important it is to maintain consistent timing with these types of medications." The implication was clear to everyone present. I was taking medication for a condition serious enough to require precise scheduling, and I was apparently forgetting to take it. Helen Cartwright's expression had shifted from friendly greeting to sympathetic concern. Sarah Beth was studying me with the analytical gaze of someone trying to detect signs of illness. "I think I'd remember starting a new medication," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The public nature of this confusion was mortifying, and I could feel my confidence evaporating under the collective gaze of my friends. "Of course you would, dear," Helen said gently, but her tone carried the patronizing sweetness typically reserved for children or the infirm. "Sometimes these things slip our minds when we have a lot on our plate." Marcus nodded gratefully at her support. "That's exactly what the doctor said might happen. He mentioned that some people experience temporary memory issues when adjusting to new medications, especially if they're dealing with stress or life changes." The conversation continued. Around me, as if I had become invisible, my literary companions began sharing stories of their own experiences with aging parents, medication management, and the challenges of maintaining independence as cognitive abilities declined. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to them discuss my condition as if I were no longer capable of participating in my own medical decisions. "Perhaps Margaret should consider asking someone to help her with medication management," Dorothy May suggested kindly. "My sister had similar issues, and her daughter set up one of those pill organizers with daily compartments." "That's an excellent idea," Marcus replied, his gratitude seeming genuine. "I've been researching some options. There are even automatic dispensers now that can remind people when it's time to take their pills." By the time we left the community center, without having discussed Margaret Atwood's novel at all, the narrative had been firmly established. I was a woman experiencing memory problems serious enough to require medication and supervision. Marcus had positioned himself as the devoted son stepping in to provide necessary care, while I had been transformed from the group's intellectual leader into an object of sympathy and concern. The pattern repeated itself with devastating effectiveness across all areas of my social life. During my weekly visit to Rosemary's Cafe, where I had been having lunch every Tuesday for 8 years, Marcus arranged to, coincidentally, arrive just as I was finishing my meal. "Mom, there you are," he said, approaching my table where I sat with Eleanor Hutchinson, my walking partner and longtime friend. "I was worried when you didn't come home. You said you were just going to the grocery store." Eleanor looked at me with surprise. "I thought you said you were meeting me for our regular Tuesday lunch." The contradiction was glaring, and I felt caught between two different versions of reality. Had I told Marcus I was going grocery shopping? I clearly remembered making plans with Eleanor for our weekly lunch date, but Marcus seemed equally certain that I had mentioned a different destination. "I must have confused myself," I said weakly, though internally I felt absolutely sure about my plans with Eleanor. Marcus turned to Eleanor with an apologetic smile. "I hope you'll understand if I'm a bit protective lately. Mom has been having some episodes where she gets confused about her schedule or forgets conversations we've had. Her doctor thinks it might be stress-related, but we're monitoring it carefully." Eleanor's expression immediately shifted to one of sympathetic concern. "Of course, Marcus, you're being wonderfully attentive. Margaret, you should have mentioned you were dealing with health issues. We're all here to support you." Once again, I found myself at the center of a conversation about my declining capabilities, discussed by people who cared about me, but were now viewing me through the lens of Marcus's carefully constructed narrative. My role in these discussions had shifted from participant to patient, from independent adult to someone requiring management and oversight. The most devastating incident occurred during Sunday service at First Methodist, where I had been an active member for over 30 years. Pastor Samuel Wright had just finished his sermon when Marcus approached him after the service, speaking in hushed tones while I was saying goodbye to other parishioners. "Pastor Wright," I heard Marcus say, "I wondered if I could speak with you privately about my mother's situation. I'm becoming increasingly concerned about her welfare." When I joined them, Pastor Wright's expression had already transformed into one of pastoral concern. "Margaret, Marcus has been telling me about some challenges you've been facing. Please know that our entire congregation is here to support you and your family during this difficult time." I looked between them, confused, about what Marcus might have shared that would prompt such a response. "I'm not sure what you mean, Pastor Wright. What challenges?" Marcus placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Mom, we discussed this on the drive here, about the medication issues and the memory concerns. You said you wanted Pastor Wright to know, so the congregation could keep you in their prayers." I had no memory of any such conversation. The 20-minute drive to church had been filled with our usual discussion of current events and my observations about the changing autumn landscape. I was certain we had not discussed any health issues or prayer requests. But Pastor Wright was nodding sympathetically, his eyes filled with the compassionate concern he typically reserved for parishioners facing serious illness or family crises. "Of course, Margaret. We'll certainly keep you in our prayers, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you need any practical support, meals, transportation, or just someone to talk with." By the time we left church that Sunday, word had spread through the congregation that I was experiencing health problems requiring special consideration and support. People who had treated me as an intellectual equal for decades now spoke to me with the careful gentleness reserved for the fragile and vulnerable. The cumulative effect of these public incidents was devastating. Within weeks, my entire social network had been convinced that I was experiencing significant cognitive decline. Friends began speaking more slowly and clearly when addressing me, as if I might not understand normal conversation. Invitations to social events began arriving with subtle suggestions that Marcus might want to accompany me for support. Most painfully, I began to see myself reflected in their worried eyes. The confident, competent woman I had always been was disappearing, replaced by someone who required careful management and constant monitoring. The respect I had earned through decades of teaching and community involvement had been erased by a few carefully orchestrated incidents of apparent confusion. What made it all so convincing was Marcus's consistent presentation as the loving, concerned son. He never spoke about my supposed problems with anything but worry and affection. He praised my former accomplishments while expressing sadness about my current difficulties. He positioned himself as my advocate and protector, making it impossible for anyone to question his motives or methods. I began to withdraw from social activities, partly because the public episodes were so embarrassing, and partly because I was no longer sure I could trust my own memory of events. The isolation that resulted only made me more dependent on Marcus's version of reality, more vulnerable to his continued manipulation of my world. Looking back, I can see how masterfully he had played on the community's natural tendency to rally around someone they perceived as vulnerable. By making my supposed decline public, he had created a network of witnesses who would later testify to my incompetence if needed. He had also ensured that any attempt I might make to contradict his version of events would be seen as further evidence of my confusion and denial. The woman who had spent 43 years teaching critical thinking skills had become a case study in how effectively those skills could be undermined by someone who understood the power of public perception and social proof. The legal documents arrived on a crisp November morning, delivered in a manila envelope that Marcus placed carefully beside my breakfast plate as if it contained nothing more significant than utility bills or magazine subscriptions. The autumn light streaming through the kitchen windows seemed to dim as I opened the envelope and spread its contents across the table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals over 3 decades. Power of attorney forms, healthcare directives, trust documents, estate planning paperwork, page after page of legal language that would effectively transfer control of everything I had worked for, everything Robert and I had built together, into Marcus's capable hands. "I know this seems overwhelming, Mom," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from me with his own cup of coffee. His tone was gentle, patient, the same voice he probably used with elderly clients in his law practice. "But given everything that's been happening lately, I think we need to be proactive about protecting your interests." I stared at the documents, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to process the magnitude of what he was proposing. The legal terminology was dense and complex, but the basic intent was clear. These papers would give Marcus complete authority over my financial affairs, medical decisions, and living arrangements. I would retain the illusion of independence while surrendering all actual control over my life. "Marcus, I don't understand why this is necessary," I said, looking up from the papers. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I've been doing so successfully for years." His expression grew troubled, that familiar look of concern that had become so common in our interactions. "Mom, I wish that were still true, but you have to acknowledge what's been happening. The medication confusion, the memory lapses, the incidents at church and book club. Dr. Morrison is concerned enough that he's recommended we start planning for the possibility that your condition might deteriorate." "What condition?" I asked, feeling a spike of alarm. "Dr. Morrison hasn't said anything to me about any condition. When did you speak with him?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "Mom, we talked about this yesterday. You were there when I called his office. You even spoke with him yourself about the medication adjustments and the referral to the specialist." I felt the familiar disorientation that had become increasingly common in recent weeks. Had there been a phone call with Dr. Morrison? I had. No memory of it, yet Marcus seemed absolutely certain. The gap in my recollection was terrifying, another piece of evidence that perhaps my mind was truly failing in ways I couldn't perceive. "Even if there were some concerns," I said weakly, "wouldn't it be premature to sign over all my decision-making authority? Couldn't we wait and see what the specialist says?" "That's exactly the problem," Marcus replied, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered with notes in his precise handwriting. "By the time cognitive decline reaches a certain point, you might no longer be legally competent to make these decisions. If we wait too long, the courts could end up appointing a stranger as your guardian, someone who doesn't know you, doesn't care about your wishes, and would only be interested in minimizing their own liability." The scenario he painted was genuinely frightening. I had heard horror stories about court-appointed guardians who treated their wards like paychecks, warehousing elderly people in substandard facilities while draining their assets through excessive fees. The thought of ending up at the mercy of such a system was almost unbearable. "These documents ensure that someone who loves you will be making decisions in your best interests," Marcus continued. "Everything would remain exactly as it is now, except that I would have the legal authority to help you when you need it." He gestured to the trust paperwork. "This arrangement would actually protect your assets better than the current setup. Instead of everything being vulnerable to potential exploitation or poor decision-making, your wealth would be managed professionally according to your stated wishes." "My stated wishes?" I asked, scanning the dense legal language. "I don't remember stating any wishes about trust arrangements." "We discussed this several times over the past few weeks," Marcus said patiently. "You expressed concerns about making financial mistakes during episodes of confusion. You specifically mentioned wanting safeguards in place to prevent you from being taken advantage of by scammers or making impulsive decisions you might regret later." Once again, I found myself trapped between Marcus's confident recollection and my own complete lack of memory about these supposed conversations. The possibility that I was having detailed discussions that I couldn't remember was perhaps more frightening than any other symptom I might be experiencing. Marcus spread out additional papers, pointing to specific sections highlighted in yellow. Look, everything is designed to preserve your autonomy as much as possible. You would continue living in your own home, managing your daily affairs, maintaining your social activities. The only difference is that major financial decisions would require my approval, and I would have the authority to step in if you were being manipulated or exploited. The logic seemed sound, even protective, yet something deep in my gut rebelled against the idea of surrendering control. What if I wanted to travel, or make a major purchase, or donate to charity? Would I need your permission for everything? Not everything, Marcus assured me. The trust allows for reasonable personal expenses and normal lifestyle choices. But yes, for major financial decisions, selling property, large withdrawals, significant investments, there would be oversight. That's exactly the kind of protection you need right now. He pulled out his phone and showed me a contact entry. I've already spoken with Thomas Brennan at First National Trust. He's one of the most respected estate attorneys in the state, and he's prepared to handle all the paperwork. He's even offered to come here this afternoon to explain everything and witness your signatures. The speed with which everything was moving felt overwhelming. This afternoon? Don't you think I should take some time to review these documents? Thoroughly. Maybe consult with my own attorney. Marcus's expression grew more serious. Mom, your attorney is Hamilton Pierce, who's been semi-retired for years and mainly handles simple wills and property transfers. This is complex estate planning that requires specialized expertise. Besides, Thomas has already reviewed your entire financial situation and designed these documents specifically for your needs. He's reviewed my financial situation? How is that possible? I haven't given anyone permission to access my accounts. You provided all the information yourself last week, Marcus said, his tone growing slightly impatient. Don't you remember? You were worried about having everything organized for tax purposes, so you gathered all your investment statements and account information. We went through everything together and created a comprehensive financial picture. I stared at him in growing horror. If what he was saying was true, then I had participated in detailed financial planning sessions that I couldn't remember at all. The implications were staggering. How could I be having complex conversations and making important decisions that left no trace in my memory? I think I should call Hamilton anyway, I said, reaching for my phone, just to get his perspective on whether this type of arrangement is really necessary. Marcus gently placed his hand over mine, stopping me from dialing. Actually, I already spoke with Hamilton about your situation. He agrees that proactive planning is essential given your recent episodes. In fact, he was the one who recommended Thomas Brennan's firm. You spoke with Hamilton about me? When? Yesterday? After your appointment with Dr. Morrison. You suggested I call him while you were resting. You said you trusted both of us to work out the best approach for protecting your interests. The conversation felt like quicksand, each question pulling me deeper into uncertainty about my own experiences and decisions. If Marcus was telling the truth, then I was apparently living large portions of my life in a fog of confusion, making important choices that I couldn't recall, and having significant conversations that left no impression on my memory. Look, Marcus said, checking his watch. Thomas will be here at 2 o'clock. Why don't you spend some time reviewing the documents, and if you have questions, you can ask him directly. He's an expert at explaining complex legal concepts in terms that anyone can understand. As I sat alone with the paperwork after Marcus left for what he called a quick client meeting, I tried to make sense of the dense legal language. The documents were professionally prepared and seemed to cover every possible contingency. There were provisions for my care if I became incapacitated, instructions for managing my investments, even detailed preferences for my living arrangements if independent. Living became impossible. The problem was that none of the preferences detailed in these documents felt like mine. The investment strategy was more conservative than I would have chosen. The healthcare directives included restrictions I had never considered necessary. The living arrangement preferences mentioned assisted care facilities I had never heard of, much less researched or approved. Yet Marcus seemed certain that I had participated in creating these documents, that every provision reflected conversations we had shared and decisions I had made. The disconnect between his version of events and my complete lack of memory was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away. When Thomas Brennan arrived that afternoon, he was exactly what I would have expected from Marcus's description: professional, knowledgeable, and reassuringly paternal. He spent an hour explaining each document in detail, answering my questions with patience and clarity. Everything he said made perfect sense from a legal and financial planning perspective. "Mrs. Whitmore," he concluded, "these arrangements represent excellent forward-thinking planning. Many families wait until a crisis occurs before addressing these issues, which often results in far less favorable outcomes. By taking proactive steps now, while you're still capable of making informed decisions, you're ensuring that your wishes will be respected and your assets will be protected." The phrase, "while you're still capable," hung in the air like a death sentence. Even this respected attorney, meeting me for the first time, seemed to accept without question that my cognitive abilities were declining and that urgent action was necessary. "What happens if I change my mind later?" I asked. "Are these arrangements permanent?" "Not at all," Thomas assured me. "As long as you retain mental capacity, you can modify or revoke any of these documents. However, I should mention that once cognitive decline reaches a certain point, changes become much more difficult from a legal standpoint. Courts are naturally suspicious of elderly people making major changes to their estate plans, especially if family members raise concerns about their mental state." The message was clear: sign now while I was still considered competent, or risk losing any say in my future if my condition worsened. The choice seemed designed to eliminate any real choice at all. As evening approached and the unsigned documents lay spread across my dining room table, I felt trapped between two equally terrifying possibilities: that I was experiencing significant cognitive decline that required immediate intervention, or that I was being manipulated by someone I trusted, completely into surrendering control of my life. Either way, the woman who had confidently managed her own affairs for 71 years was apparently no longer considered capable of making her own decisions about her future. The breaking point came on a cold December evening, when I found myself staring at the unsigned legal documents that had been sitting on my dining room table for 3 weeks. Thomas Brennan had called twice. Marcus had grown increasingly insistent, and I felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. In that moment of desperate uncertainty, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I reached out to someone whose judgment I trusted completely and who had no stake in Marcus's version of events. Dorothy had been my younger sister, my closest confidant, and my most honest critic for over 7 decades. Living in Seattle with her husband of 48 years, she had maintained the sharp wit and no-nonsense perspective that had made her a successful high school principal before her retirement. Our Sunday evening phone calls had been a sacred ritual for 15 years, but lately I had been avoiding them, too embarrassed to discuss the confusion and memory problems that seemed to be consuming my life. That night, I finally called her, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. It was past 10 o'clock in Millbrook Springs, which meant it was barely 8 in Seattle, prime time for Dorothy's evening routine of reading and catching up on correspondence. "Maggie?" Her familiar voice came through the line, immediately warm, but tinged with concern. "Sweetheart, I was beginning to worry. You've missed our last 2 Sunday calls, and when I tried calling last week, Marcus said you were resting and couldn't come to the phone." The sound of her voice, so familiar and reassuring, nearly brought me to tears. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. even if the truth is difficult to hear. Always, she replied without hesitation. What's wrong? You sound upset. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what might be confirmation of my worst fears. When we talked 3 weeks ago, the last time we had a real conversation, did I seem confused to you? Did I repeat myself? Or forget things we had discussed? Or say anything that made you think I might be experiencing memory problems? There was a pause, and my heart sank, preparing for the worst. Then Dorothy spoke, her voice clear and certain. Maggie, you were sharp as a tack. You remembered details about my neighbor's garden renovation that I had forgotten myself. You quoted extensively from that new biography of Emily Dickinson, including page numbers for specific passages you wanted me to read. Why on earth would you ask me such a question? The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to sit down. Dorothy, I think I'm in serious trouble. Over the next hour, I told her everything. Marcus's return home after his divorce, the gradual onset of incidents where I couldn't remember conversations or locate misplaced items, the public episodes that had convinced my entire social circle that I was experiencing cognitive decline, and finally, the legal documents that would transfer control of my life to my son. Dorothy listened without interruption, her silence growing more ominous as my story progressed. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Margaret Catherine Whitmore, she said, using my full name as she had when we were children and she was about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. What you're describing isn't dementia. It's elder abuse. Your son is gaslighting you. The term hit me like a physical blow. I had heard of gaslighting in the context of romantic relationships, but the idea that it could happen between a parent and child, that Marcus could be deliberately manipulating my reality, seemed almost too horrible to contemplate. But what if I really am having memory problems? I asked, the doubt that had been carefully cultivated over months still clinging to my thoughts. What if Marcus is genuinely concerned and I'm just not aware of my own decline? Then you need an independent medical evaluation, Dorothy said firmly. Not from Marcus's doctor friend, not from some specialist he's recommended, but from a neurologist who has no connection to your family and no knowledge of Marcus's claims about your condition. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. An objective medical assessment would either confirm my worst fears or provide the validation I desperately needed. How do I find someone like that? Marcus has been managing my medical appointments lately, and I'm not even sure who my current doctors are supposed to be. First things first, Dorothy said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had used as a school principal when crisis management was required. Tomorrow morning, call Dr. Morrison's office directly. Don't go through Marcus, don't mention Marcus's concerns. Just schedule a routine appointment for yourself. Find out exactly what's in your medical record and what medications, if any, you're actually supposed to be taking. Her practical approach cut through the fog of confusion that had been clouding my thinking for weeks. What if Dr. Morrison confirms what Marcus has been saying? Then at least you'll know the truth from a source you trust. But Maggie, I've known you for 71 years. You've always been one of the most mentally acute people I've ever met. The idea that you would suddenly develop significant cognitive problems without any underlying medical cause, at exactly the time when your son is facing financial difficulties from his divorce, strikes me as suspiciously convenient. After hanging up with Dorothy, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had spoken with someone who saw me as I had always been, competent, intelligent, and reliable. Dorothy's perspective forced me to consider possibilities I had been too frightened and confused to examine. The next morning, I waited until Marcus left for what he called a client meeting before calling Dr. Morrison's office. His receptionist, Janet, greeted me with the same friendly professionalism she had shown for the 15 years I had been a patient. "Mrs. Whitmore, how nice to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" I'd like to schedule an appointment with Dr. Morrison, I said. Just a routine checkup. Of course. Let me check his schedule. It's been quite a while since your last visit. I show your most recent appointment was your annual physical in August. Would next Tuesday afternoon work for you? I felt a chill run through me. Janet, could you check something for me? Do your gry. Records show any recent visits or phone consultations with Dr. Morrison? Perhaps in the last month or two? I heard the clicking of computer keys before she responded. No, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing since your August appointment. Should there be? The confirmation that there had been no recent medical contact contradicted everything Marcus had told me about doctors' visits, medication prescriptions, and specialist referrals. Either Janet's records were wrong, or Marcus had been fabricating my medical history entirely. One more question, I said, my voice steady despite the growing alarm I felt. Do your records show any current prescriptions for me? Any ongoing medications? Let me see, Janet said. I show your standard multivitamin recommendation and the low-dose aspirin Dr. Morrison suggested for heart health. Nothing else. Were you expecting something different? The small white pills Marcus claimed I had been prescribed didn't exist. The medication routine he insisted I was forgetting was entirely fictional. The specialist referrals and treatment plans he had discussed were complete fabrications. Janet, I'd like to request copies of my complete medical file, I said. Could I pick those up when I come for my appointment? Absolutely. I'll have everything ready for you. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the winter garden, where snow was beginning to dust the dormant flower beds. The evidence was mounting that Dorothy was right. I wasn't experiencing cognitive decline. I was being systematically deceived by my own son. But I needed more proof before I could confront him or take any action. Marcus was a skilled attorney who had convinced everyone from pastors to physicians that I was mentally compromised. My word against his wouldn't be sufficient, especially given the public narrative he had so carefully constructed. I spent the afternoon conducting my own investigation, calling businesses and organizations where Marcus claimed I had experienced episodes of confusion. The results were consistently illuminating. The bank manager had no record of any incidents involving me. The grocery store where I supposedly became lost and disoriented had no such reports in their files. The pharmacy where Marcus claimed I had become confused about my medications confirmed that I hadn't picked up any prescriptions in over 6 months. Each phone call strengthened my conviction that I was not losing my mind. Instead, I was the victim of an elaborate deception designed to make me question my own sanity, while positioning Marcus as my necessary caretaker and eventual legal guardian. That evening, when Marcus returned home, I observed him with new eyes. The concerned son facade that had seemed so genuine now appeared calculated and rehearsed. His expressions of worry about my condition felt scripted. Even his body language seemed different when viewed through the lens of potential deception, rather than genuine care. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked, settling into what had become his customary chair at the kitchen table. "Did you remember to take your medication this morning?" For the first time in months, I answered with complete confidence. "I don't take any medication, Marcus. I never have. And Dr. Morrison's office confirmed that today when I called to schedule my appointment." His expression flickered for just a moment. Surprise, perhaps, or concern that his carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel. But he recovered quickly, his face settling back into patient worry. "Mom, we've talked about this. Dr. Morrison prescribed those pills last month. The confusion about your medications is exactly why I'm so concerned about your memory. But this time." His certainty didn't shake my confidence. This time, I had independent verification of the truth. The fog of doubt and confusion that had been clouding my thoughts for months was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a growing certainty that my son had been lying to me about everything. The question now wasn't whether I was losing my mind. It was how far Marcus was willing to go to maintain his deception, and what he ultimately planned to do with the control he was so desperately trying to gain over my life and assets. Dorothy had been right. This wasn't dementia. This was elder abuse, perpetrated by the one person who should have been protecting me. And now that I knew the truth, I had to decide what I was going to do about it. The appointment with Dr. Morrison on Tuesday afternoon provided the first concrete validation of what I had begun to suspect, but I knew I needed more than just confirmation that I wasn't taking mysterious medications. I needed definitive proof of my cognitive health, the kind of irrefutable evidence that could stand up against months of Marcus's carefully constructed narrative about my mental decline. After my meeting with Dr. Morrison, who expressed genuine bewilderment about the supposed medical visits and prescriptions Marcus had described, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and empowering. I was going to seek an independent neurological evaluation without Marcus's knowledge or involvement. Dr. Morrison had been particularly helpful in this regard. Margaret, given the concerning claims that have apparently been made about your mental state, I think a comprehensive neurological assessment would be wise, he had said, his expression serious. I can refer you to Dr. Amanda Roswell at the Riverside Medical Institute. She's one of the most respected cognitive specialists in the region, and she has particular expertise in distinguishing between genuine cognitive decline and other factors that might affect memory and functioning. The drive to Riverside took nearly 2 hours, winding through countryside that Robert and I had explored countless times during our marriage. I had arranged for Eleanor to accompany me, telling her simply that I needed a second opinion about some health concerns. Eleanor, bless her, had asked no probing questions and had even insisted on driving, sensing perhaps that this was more serious than a routine medical appointment. Dr. Roswell's office was located in a modern medical complex that specialized in neurological and psychological services. The waiting room was filled with patients of various ages, some accompanied by family members, others sitting alone with the patient expressions of people facing uncertain medical futures. I found myself studying their faces, wondering how many were there because of genuine medical concerns versus how many might be victims of manipulation like myself. When Dr. Roswell called my name, I was struck immediately by her professional demeanor combined with genuine warmth. She was perhaps 50 years old, with short silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was filled with medical texts and journals, but also included personal touches, photographs of what appeared to be her own family, and artwork that suggested someone who valued both scientific precision and human connection. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, settling behind her desk with a thick folder that I assumed contained the referral information from Dr. Morrison. "I understand you're seeking an evaluation of your cognitive function. Can you tell me in your own words, what concerns have brought you here today?" I had prepared for this moment during the long drive, but actually articulating my situation felt both liberating and terrifying. "Dr. Roswell, for the past several months, my son has been telling me, and everyone else in my life, that I'm experiencing significant memory problems and cognitive decline. He claims I forget conversations, misplace items, and have episodes of confusion. But I have no memory of these incidents, and some of the medical claims he's made appear to be fabricated." Dr. Roswell listened intently, taking notes as I described the pattern of incidents Marcus had reported, the public episodes that had convinced my social circle of my mental decline, and the legal documents he was pressuring me to sign. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I sensed a growing alertness as I detailed the systematic nature of the alleged episodes. "Mrs. Whitmore, have you ever experienced periods of confusion or memory loss that you were aware of? Times when you genuinely couldn't remember conversations or actions you had taken?" "No," I replied firmly. "Every incident Marcus has described is something I have no recollection of, which he attributes to my condition. But when these supposed episodes aren't occurring, which is most of the time, I feel completely normal. I can remember everything, clearly, function independently, and engage in complex activities without difficulty. I see. And these incidents primarily occur when your son is present to witness them? The question crystallized something I had been unconsciously aware of but hadn't articulated. Yes, actually. Now that you mention it, I don't recall any incidents of confusion when I'm alone or with other people. It's only when Marcus is around that these problems seem to manifest. Dr. Roswell made additional notes before looking up at me directly. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to conduct a comprehensive evaluation that will assess multiple aspects of your cognitive function. This will include memory tests, reasoning assessments, attention and concentration evaluations, and language processing examinations. The entire process will take several hours, but it will provide a definitive picture of your neurological health. The testing that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Dr. Roswell guided me through a series of exercises that challenged different aspects of mental function. I was asked to memorize lists of words and recall them after delays, solve mathematical problems of increasing complexity, identify patterns in visual presentations, and respond to rapid-fire questions designed to test my processing speed. Some of the tests reminded me of the intellectual challenges I had always enjoyed: analyzing literature, solving puzzles, engaging in complex discussions. Others were more clinical and unfamiliar, but I found myself approaching each task with the same methodical attention I had brought to lesson planning and curriculum development during my teaching career. Throughout the evaluation, Dr. Roswell observed not just my answers, but my approach to problems, my ability to stay focused during lengthy tasks, and my emotional responses to challenging questions. She noted when I asked for clarification how I organized my thoughts, and whether I showed signs of frustration or confusion when faced with difficult material. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said during a brief break, "I'm particularly interested in your description of the incidents your son has reported. Can you think of any pattern to when they allegedly occur? Any common circumstances or triggers?" I considered her question carefully. They seem to happen when Marcus needs to demonstrate my incompetence to others, before social events where he can publicly express concern, when important decisions need to be made, or when he's trying to convince family members that I need supervision. And during our testing today, have you experienced any moments of confusion, memory lapses, or difficulty understanding instructions? No, none at all. I feel completely like myself. After 4 hours of comprehensive testing, Dr. Roswell compiled her results while I waited anxiously in her office. When she returned, she carried a thick folder of test results and assessment forms. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began, her tone professional but reassuring, "I want to be completely clear about my findings. Your cognitive function tests at above average levels for your age group. Your memory, both short-term and long-term, is excellent. Your reasoning abilities, problem-solving skills, and language processing are all within superior ranges. I found no evidence whatsoever of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, or any form of neurological decline. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I felt lightheaded. So I'm not losing my mind? Absolutely not. Based on these comprehensive assessments, you are cognitively healthy and fully competent. The symptoms your son has described, if they were genuine, would have shown up clearly in these tests. The fact that you perform at such high levels suggests that any reported incidents of confusion or memory loss are not neurologically based." Dr. Roswell leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you've described to me, the systematic reporting of cognitive problems that don't appear in objective testing, the public incidents designed to convince others of your incompetence, the pressure to sign legal documents transferring control of your affairs, these are classic patterns of psychological elder abuse. The term elder abuse spoken by a medical professional carried a weight that Dorothy's sisterly concern hadn't quite conveyed. This wasn't just family drama or generational misunderstanding. This was a recognized form of criminal behavior with Serious legal and psychological implications. Can you document this in a formal report? I asked. Something I could use to counter the narrative my son has created about my condition? Absolutely. I'll prepare a comprehensive neurological assessment that details all test results and provides my professional opinion about your cognitive health. This document will make it clear that you show no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, and that you are fully competent to make your own decisions about your life and affairs. As Dr. Roswell explained the process for obtaining my report, I felt a transformation taking place within me. The fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my thoughts for months was completely lifting, replaced by a clarity that was almost painful in its intensity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had objective, professional validation of what I had known deep down, but had been convinced to doubt. I wasn't confused, declining, or incompetent. I was the victim of a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation designed to make me surrender control of my life to someone who had no right to it. But having proof of my competence was only the first step. Now I had to decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. How do you confront your own child with evidence of their betrayal? How do you rebuild relationships with people who had been convinced of your incompetence? And most importantly, how do you prevent this from happening to other vulnerable elderly people who might not be as fortunate as I was in discovering the truth? As Eleanor and I drove home through the darkening countryside, the sealed envelope containing Dr. Roswell's report resting in my purse like a weapon I wasn't yet sure how to use, I knew that my life had just taken a dramatic turn. The scared, confused woman who had made this trip was gone forever, replaced by someone who now understood exactly what she was fighting against and why that fight was essential. Marcus thought he had carefully dismantled my reality. What he had actually done was provide me with the motivation and evidence I needed to reclaim not just my own life, but my sense of purpose in protecting others who might face similar predatory behavior. The victim was about to become an advocate, and the student was about to teach her son a lesson about the consequences of underestimating his mother's intelligence and resilience. The confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating came on a snowy Thursday evening in mid-January. Marcus had been growing increasingly agitated about my continued refusal to sign the legal documents, and Thomas Brennan had called twice that week expressing concern about the delay in finalizing Mrs. Whitmore's estate planning. I knew I couldn't postpone the inevitable much longer without raising suspicions that might prompt Marcus to escalate his tactics. I had spent the week since receiving Dr. Roswell's report, gathering additional evidence and building my support network. The sealed medical evaluation sat in my desk drawer like a loaded gun, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. But I knew that confronting Marcus alone would be a mistake. His skills as an attorney would allow him to manipulate the situation, question my interpretation of events, or even claim that seeking the evaluation was further evidence of my confusion. That's why I had asked Patricia to visit that evening, ostensibly for our postponed discussion about the boys' spring break visit. Patricia arrived at 6 o'clock, bringing homemade soup and fresh bread, her usual offerings when she sensed something was troubling me. She had seemed genuinely concerned about my recent behavior, noting that I appeared distracted and withdrawn during our phone conversations. Marcus joined us for dinner, playing the role of the devoted son with his usual skill. He asked about Patricia's work at the Children's Hospital, inquired about his nephew's academic progress, and expressed gratitude for her support during what he termed this difficult period with Mom's health concerns. "I'm glad you're here tonight. Patricia," Marcus said as we finished our meal, "I've been wanting to discuss Mom's situation with you when she could hear our conversation directly. I think it's important that she understand how much we both care about her welfare." Patricia looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "What kind of situation, Marcus? Mom seems fine to me." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus replied, his voice taking on the patient tone I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Mom has been experiencing episodes of confusion and memory loss for months now, but they're often subtle, and might not be immediately obvious to occasional visitors. I watched Patricia's expression change as Marcus began recounting the familiar litany of incidents, the supposed medication confusion, the misplaced items, the forgotten conversations. His presentation was masterful, filled with specific details, and delivered with apparent reluctance, as if he were sharing painful family secrets he would prefer to keep private. The doctor has recommended some significant interventions, Marcus continued, including medication management assistance and possibly arranging for supervised care. Mom has been resistant to these suggestions, which is unfortunately common with this type of condition. Patricia turned to me with the expression of sympathetic concern I had seen on so many faces over the past months. Mom, is this true? Are you having memory problems? This was the moment I had been preparing for. Instead of allowing Marcus to control the narrative as he had done so many times before, I reached into the folder I had placed on the sideboard and removed Dr. Roswell's comprehensive report. Patricia, I want you to read something before we continue this conversation, I said, handing her the sealed envelope. Last week, I underwent extensive neurological testing at the Riverside Institute. These are the results. Marcus's face went pale as he realized what I was presenting. Mom, what kind of testing? I thought we agreed you would wait for the specialist referral I arranged. I decided to get an independent evaluation, I replied calmly, from a neurologist who had no preconceived notions about my condition and no connection to our family. Patricia broke the seal and began reading Dr. Roswell's report aloud. Patient exhibits no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or neurological decline. Memory function, executive reasoning, and cognitive processing all test within superior ranges for age group. Patient demonstrates excellent mental acuity and is fully competent to make independent decisions regarding her personal and financial affairs. She looked up, confusion evident on her face. I don't understand. Marcus, you said the doctor was concerned about Mom's condition. There must be some mistake, Marcus said quickly. Mom, who is this Dr. Roswell? Did you explain your symptoms to her properly? These types of evaluations can be misleading if the patient doesn't provide complete information about their episodes. I provided completely accurate information, I replied firmly. I described every incident you've reported about my supposed confusion and memory loss. Dr. Roswell's professional opinion is that these incidents, if they occurred as described, are not neurologically based. The implication hung in the air like an accusation. Patricia looked between us, beginning to grasp that something more complex was happening than a simple disagreement about medical care. Marcus, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside me. I've also verified that many of the medical claims you've made are simply false. Dr. Morrison's office has no record of recent visits or medication prescriptions. The specialist referrals you mentioned don't exist. The episodes of confusion you've reported to friends and neighbors have no independent witnesses except you. Marcus's expression shifted rapidly between surprise, anger, and calculation. I could almost see his legal mind working, searching for ways to discredit my evidence or reframe the situation to his advantage. Mom, this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking I've been worried about, he said, his voice taking on a tone of professional concern. You're imagining conspiracies, questioning medical care that actually happened. This evaluation you arranged, without consulting, me could have been influenced by your own confused recollections of events. But this time, his confident assertions didn't shake my certainty. I had too much evidence, too many independent confirmations of the truth. Patricia, I said, turning to my daughter, your brother has been systematically lying about my mental health for months. He's hidden my belongings and claimed I misplaced them. He's fabricated conversations about medical care that never happened. He's convinced our entire social circle that I'm experiencing cognitive decline, all in preparation for pressuring me to sign legal documents that would give him control over my finances and property. Patricia stared at Marcus, horror dawning. in her eyes. "Marcus, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been manipulating Mom." Marcus straightened, his attorney persona taking over completely. "Patricia, this is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Mom is having a paranoid episode, creating elaborate explanations for normal concerns about her welfare. The fact that she sought medical care without involving family members and is now making accusations against people trying to help her shows how seriously her condition has deteriorated." His response was so smoothly delivered, so professionally convincing, that for a moment I worried Patricia might believe him. But then she asked the question that cut through all his careful manipulation. "Marcus, if Mom is really experiencing cognitive decline, why does this medical report show no evidence of it? How do you explain comprehensive neurological testing? That contradicts everything you've been saying?" Marcus paused, clearly struggling to find an explanation that wouldn't expose the fundamental impossibility of his position. Medical testing can be unreliable, especially if the patient coaches their responses or if the episodes are intermittent. Mom obviously prepared for this evaluation and presented herself in the best possible light. "Or," I interjected quietly, "the testing is accurate, and the episodes you've described never actually occurred." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia sat holding the medical report, looking at her brother with an expression of dawning comprehension and disgust. Marcus remained rigid in his chair, his mask of concern finally beginning to slip. "Patricia," I continued, "I want you to know that this isn't just about me. I've discovered that Marcus has been investigating other elderly clients from his law practice. I found research materials in his room about their assets, family situations, and potential vulnerabilities. I believe he was planning to target other people using the same tactics he's used on me." This revelation hit Patricia like a physical blow. "Marcus, please tell me Mom is wrong about this. Please tell me you weren't planning to hurt other people." Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. The concerned son facade fell away, replaced by the cold calculation I had glimpsed in moments when he thought I wasn't watching. "You have no idea what it's like," he said, his voice bitter and angry. "Working my entire career to build something substantial, only to lose half of it to Jessica in a divorce I didn't want. Meanwhile, Mom sits in this house worth nearly $1 million, with investment accounts she doesn't even understand, while I'm struggling to rebuild my practice and pay crushing alimony payments." The naked greed and entitlement in his voice shocked even me, despite everything I had suspected about his motives. "So you decided to steal it," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I decided to manage it better than she can," Marcus replied defiantly. "Everything would have come to us eventually anyway. I was just ensuring it would be handled competently instead of being wasted or lost to poor decisions made by someone who's clearly not thinking as sharply as she used to." "By convincing everyone I have dementia," I said, finally giving voice to the full scope of his betrayal. "By making me question my own sanity. By isolating me from friends and family who might have noticed what you were doing." Marcus looked at us both, realizing perhaps for the first time that his carefully constructed plan had completely unraveled. The legal documents remained unsigned, his manipulation had been exposed, and the family support he had counted on was evaporating before his eyes. "You can't prove any of this," he said finally. "It's the word of a confused elderly woman against her son who's been trying to help her." But even as he spoke, I could see that he knew the truth. Dr. Roswell's report, combined with my independent verification of his lies about medical care, created a paper trail that would be difficult to explain away. More importantly, Patricia now understood exactly what her brother had been doing and why. The son I had raised, educated, and supported through law school had revealed himself to be capable of psychological cruelty that took my breath away. But the victim he had tried to create was still very much alive, and she was about to ensure that there would be consequences for his actions. The confrontation was over, but the real battle for justice and accountability was just beginning. The aftermath. of that devastating confrontation unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even me. Within hours of Marcus's mask finally slipping completely, Patricia had called the Millbrook Springs Police Department to report suspected elder abuse, and by morning, Detective Sarah Chen was sitting in my living room, her digital recorder capturing every detail of the psychological manipulation I had endured for months. Detective Chen was a compact woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with complex family crimes. She had specialized training in financial exploitation cases and immediately grasped the sophisticated nature of Marcus's scheme. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, reviewing the timeline we had constructed together, "what your son did represents multiple criminal offenses under state elder abuse statutes. The systematic psychological manipulation, the fabrication of medical conditions, the pressure to sign financial documents under false pretenses. These aren't just family disputes. They're serious crimes." The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Marcus's planning. When police executed a search warrant on his temporary residence, the guest room he had occupied in my home, they discovered files that painted a chilling picture of calculated predation. Hidden in his laptop were detailed financial profiles of 6 elderly clients from his law practice, complete with asset valuations, family relationship analyses, and assessments of each person's potential vulnerability to manipulation. Notes in Marcus's handwriting outlined strategies for gaining control of their affairs, including manufactured health crises and systematic isolation from support networks. Most damaging of all was a document Detective Chen described as a playbook for elder exploitation. Marcus had created a step-by-step guide for convincing family members and communities that an elderly person was experiencing cognitive decline, complete with suggested incidents to stage and phrases to use when expressing concern to medical professionals. "He wasn't just targeting you, Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Chen explained during one of our interviews. "This was a business model. He was planning to systematically exploit elderly clients who trusted him with their legal affairs." The evidence also revealed that Marcus had been recording our conversations for months, not to document my supposed confusion as he had claimed, but to edit recordings that could be taken out of context and presented as evidence of cognitive decline. The technology he had been using was sophisticated, allowing him to create audio clips that seemed to show me asking the same questions repeatedly or expressing confusion about basic facts. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus initially maintained his innocence, claiming that his research was for academic purposes and that his concerns about my health were genuine. But as Detective Chen and the district attorney's office built their case, the weight of documentation became overwhelming. The legal proceedings began in earnest when the district attorney's office filed formal charges: elder abuse, attempted, financial exploitation, fraud, and identity theft. The charges related to identity theft stemmed from forged signatures on documents Marcus had used to gain access to my financial information from various institutions. Thomas Brennan, the estate attorney who had been pressuring me to sign the power of attorney documents, was also investigated. While he wasn't charged criminally, the State Bar Association launched an ethics inquiry into his role in facilitating what appeared to be elder exploitation. He claimed he had been deceived by Marcus about my condition and had acted in good faith, but his failure to conduct independent verification of my supposed cognitive decline raised serious questions about his professional conduct. The trial took place 8 months after that confrontational dinner, in the county courthouse where I had once attended school board meetings and community events as a respected member of the community. Now I was there as a crime victim, preparing to testify against my own son in front of a courtroom filled with people I had known for decades. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, was a seasoned professional who specialized in white-collar crimes against the elderly. She had prepared me thoroughly for my testimony, explaining that Marcus's defense team would likely try to portray me as a confused elderly woman whose accusations were themselves evidence of cognitive decline. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said during our final preparation session, "your strength as a witness is your evident competence and clarity. Dr. Roswell's neurological evaluation will speak for itself, but your demeanor and testimony will demonstrate to the jury that you're fully capable of understanding what happened to you and why it was wrong." When I took the witness stand on a bright Tuesday morning in September, I felt a strange sense of completion. The scared, confused woman who had questioned her own sanity just months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she had survived and why her testimony mattered. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prosecutor Santos began, "can you tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant before he moved into your home?" I described the loving relationship I had enjoyed with Marcus throughout his life, his successful career as an attorney, and the pride I had felt in his accomplishments. I wanted the jury to understand that my accusations weren't motivated by any long-standing animosity or family conflict. "And when he asked to move in with you after his divorce, how did you respond?" "I welcomed him with open arms," I said, looking directly at the jury. "He was my child in crisis, and I wanted to provide whatever support he needed to rebuild his life." The questioning continued for over 2 hours, covering every aspect of Marcus's manipulation campaign. I described the gradual onset of incidents, where items would disappear and reappear, the conversations he claimed we had shared that I couldn't remember, the public episodes designed to convince others of my cognitive decline. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you ever genuinely forget conversations or misplace items in the ways your son described?" "No," I replied firmly. Every incident he reported was something I had no memory of experiencing. When these supposed episodes weren't occurring, which was most of the time when he wasn't present, I functioned completely normally. The most powerful moment came when Prosecutor Santos introduced Dr. Roswell's neurological evaluation. The detailed medical report provided objective, scientific evidence that directly contradicted months of Marcus's claims about my mental state. "Dr. Roswell's evaluation shows that you tested at above-average levels for your age group in all areas of cognitive function," Prosecutor Santos noted. "How do you explain this result if you were indeed experiencing the memory problems your son described?" "I can't explain it," I said, "because those memory problems never existed. They were fabricated by my son to justify taking control of my life and assets." Marcus's defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Robert Walsh, attempted to undermine my credibility during cross-examination. His strategy was to suggest that I was an unreliable narrator of my own experiences, that my anger at being misunderstood had led me to construct elaborate conspiracy theories about my son's motives. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it possible that you simply don't remember the episodes of confusion your son described? That your current clarity doesn't negate previous periods of cognitive difficulty?" "No," I replied calmly. "If I had been experiencing genuine episodes of confusion severe enough to warrant the interventions my son was proposing, those deficits would have shown up clearly in comprehensive neurological testing." "But couldn't you have prepared for that? Testing? Studied the likely questions and practiced your responses?" I looked at him steadily. "Mr. Walsh, I spent 43 years as an educator. I understand the difference between memorizing answers and demonstrating genuine cognitive ability. Dr. Roswell's evaluation tested my capacity to process new information, solve problems I had never encountered, and perform complex mental tasks in real time. You can't prepare for that kind of assessment by studying." The defense's case ultimately crumbled under the weight of evidence. They couldn't explain away the forged documents, the fabricated medical claims, or the detailed plans Marcus had made to exploit other elderly clients. Most damaging of all, they couldn't provide any credible explanation for why a woman experiencing significant cognitive decline would test at superior levels on comprehensive neurological evaluations. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 3 hours of deliberation, I felt a complex mixture of relief and profound sadness. Guilty on all counts: elder abuse, attempted financial exploitation, fraud, and identity theft. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same professional composure he had displayed throughout the trial. But I could see something broken in his eyes, perhaps the final recognition that his calculated gamble had failed completely. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to my family doctor, sentenced Marcus to 6 years in state prison, noting that his crimes represented a profound betrayal of familial trust and a calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society. "Mr. Whitmore," she said during sentencing, "you used your legal training and your position as a trusted family member to perpetrate psychological abuse against your own mother. The court finds your actions particularly reprehensible because they were premeditated, systematic, and designed to make the victim question her own sanity." As the bailiff led Marcus away, he turned back briefly and our eyes met. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the little boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, seeking comfort from the noise and chaos that frightened him. But that child was gone, replaced by someone who had chosen greed and manipulation over love and integrity. The legal victory felt hollow in many ways. I had won vindication for myself and protection for future potential victims, but I had also lost a son. The family I had worked so hard to nurture and maintain had been irrevocably damaged by choices Marcus had made and consequences he would now face. But as I left the courthouse that day, surrounded by Patricia and her children, by Eleanor and other friends who had supported me throughout the ordeal, I realized that while I had lost one relationship, I had gained something perhaps even more valuable: absolute certainty about my own strength, competence, and worth. The scared, confused woman who had questioned her own sanity was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that truth, however painful, was always preferable to comfortable lies. The months following Marcus's sentencing brought a period of deliberate reconstruction that felt both necessary and surprisingly liberating. I approached the task of rebuilding my life with the same methodical attention I had once brought to curriculum planning, understanding that healing would require both practical steps and emotional work that couldn't be rushed. The first priority was reclaiming my home. Marcus's presence had left subtle marks throughout the house, rearranged furniture to accommodate his temporary office, changed routines that had revolved around his schedule, and, most significantly, the psychological residue of months spent questioning my own perceptions within these familiar walls. I spent weeks methodically returning each room to its proper configuration, a process that felt like reclaiming my own identity piece by piece. The master bedroom required particular attention. I had it professionally cleaned and repainted, replacing the carpet where Marcus's legal files had left indentations and refreshing the space with new linens that carried no memories of his occupation. When I finally moved back into the room Robert and I had shared for over 3 decades, it felt like coming home to myself. More challenging was the work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by Marcus's manipulation campaign. Many people in Millbrook Springs had genuinely believed they were witnessing my cognitive decline, and their treatment of me during those months, however well-intentioned, had created wounds that couldn't be healed simply by explaining what had really happened. My first conversation with Pastor Wright at First Methodist was particularly difficult. He had been one of the community members most completely convinced by Marcus's portrayal of my condition, and our interaction during those months had fundamentally changed from peer discussion to pastoral care for someone he believed was mentally compromised. "Margaret," he said when I requested a private meeting in his office, "I owe you a profound apology. I should have questioned what I was being told about your condition instead of simply accepting it. As a spiritual leader, I should have been more discerning about the difference between genuine care and manipulation." His acknowledgement meant more than I had expected. "Pastor Wright, you responded with compassion to what you believed was a parishioner in need. Marcus's deception was sophisticated enough to fool medical professionals and family members. I don't hold you responsible for being manipulated by someone I trusted completely." The conversation with my book club proved more complex. Helen Cartwright, who had been coming to literary discussions for 15 years, struggled particularly with the revelation that she had been deceived. "Margaret, I keep thinking about that day when Marcus came to get you during our meeting," she said when the group gathered for our first post-trial discussion. "I was so convinced you needed help, so ready to accept that you were declining. It makes me question my judgment about everything." "Helen, that's exactly what Marcus was counting on," I replied. "He understood that caring people would naturally want to help someone they believed was vulnerable. Your compassion wasn't wrong. It was just misdirected by someone who exploited it." Sarah Beth Williams, our retired librarian, raised a question that several members had been thinking. How do we make sure something like this never happens again? How do we protect each other from this kind of manipulation? Her question prompted a discussion that would ultimately lead to one of the most meaningful projects of my recovery period. We decided to develop an educational program for the community about elder abuse recognition and prevention, using my experience as a case study while protecting the privacy of other potential victims. The work with Patricia and her children required its own careful attention. The boys, now 13, had been shielded from the worst details of their uncle's crimes, but they knew enough to understand that someone they had trusted had done something terrible to their grandmother. Patricia worried constantly about how the betrayal might affect their ability to trust family relationships in the future. "Mom, I keep second-guessing every interaction I had with Marcus over the past year," Patricia told me during one of our weekly dinners, which had resumed their regular schedule. "Were there signs I should have seen? Times when I should have questioned what he was telling me?" "Patricia, Marcus spent months conditioning all of us to accept his version of events. He started with small inconsistencies and gradually built to major fabrications, giving everyone time to adjust to each new level of concern about my condition. You weren't naive. You were systematically deceived by someone with extensive training in persuasion and manipulation." The conversation I had been dreading most was with Dorothy, my sister who had been instrumental in helping me recognize the abuse, but who also carried guilt about not intervening sooner. "Maggie, I knew something wasn't right when you started missing our Sunday calls," she said during her first visit to Millbrook Springs since the trial. "I should have gotten on a plane immediately and seen what was happening for myself. Dorothy, you did exactly what I needed you to do. You provided the outside perspective that allowed me to question what I was experiencing. Without that phone call when you confirmed my mental clarity, I might never have sought independent medical evaluation." Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of my recovery was the sense of purpose that emerged from sharing my story with others. Detective Chen had remained in touch throughout the legal proceedings, and she began referring other potential elder abuse victims to me for support and guidance. The first person she sent was Eleanor Masterson, a 78-year-old widow whose adult daughter had been systematically isolating her from friends while gaining control of her finances. Eleanor's situation was different from mine. Her daughter was motivated by drug addiction rather than calculated greed, but the psychological manipulation tactics were remarkably similar. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said during our first meeting, "Detective Chen told me you would understand what I'm going through. She said you had survived something similar." Sitting with Eleanor in my living room, seeing the confusion and self-doubt in her eyes that I recognized from my own experience, I felt a clarity about my path forward that surprised me with its intensity. "Eleanor, the most important thing I can tell you is that you're not losing your mind. When someone you love systematically undermines your reality, it's natural to question your own perceptions. But that questioning doesn't mean you're wrong about what's happening to you." Over the following weeks, I helped Eleanor document the inconsistencies in her daughter's claims, connected her with appropriate medical and legal resources, and most importantly, provided the consistent validation she needed to trust her own experiences. When her case went to court 6 months later, Eleanor was able to testify with confidence about the manipulation she had endured. The work with Eleanor led to connections with other advocacy organizations, and I found myself increasingly involved in educational efforts around elder abuse prevention. The Millbrook Springs Community Center asked me to develop a workshop series, and the regional library system invited me to speak at branches throughout the county. Each presentation was emotionally challenging, but also deeply satisfying. I could see recognition in the faces of elderly audience members who had experienced similar manipulation, and I watched adult children begin to understand warning signs they might need to watch for in their own families. The key, I would tell audiences, is understanding that elder abuse often comes from people we trust most completely. It's not the stranger at the door trying to sell questionable investments. It's the family member who gradually convinces everyone that you're no longer capable of making your own decisions. Dr. Roswell, the neurologist whose evaluation had been so crucial to my case, invited me to speak at a conference on cognitive assessment and elder abuse. Standing before an audience of medical professionals, I felt the full weight of how far I had come from the confused, frightened woman who had first sought her help. Medical professionals, I told the conference, you have enormous power to validate or undermine an elderly person's sense of their own competence. When family members report cognitive decline, please consider the possibility that those reports might be motivated by factors other than genuine concern for the patient's welfare. The advocacy work provided structure and meaning to my days, but it also required me to revisit traumatic experiences repeatedly. Some evenings, after particularly difficult presentations or support sessions, I would find myself exhausted by the emotional weight of constantly processing psychological manipulation and family betrayal. During those times, I returned to activities that had always grounded me, working in my garden, reading literature that had shaped my thinking over decades, and maintaining the routines that had sustained me through earlier life challenges. The physical work of tending plants and the intellectual engagement of analyzing complex texts provided balance to the emotionally demanding advocacy work. One evening, as I sat in my garden watching fireflies dance over the flower beds I had restored since Marcus's departure, I realized that while I had lost one version of my life, I had gained something unexpected. A clarity about my own strength and a sense of purpose that grew directly from surviving betrayal. The scared, confused woman who had questioned her own sanity was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was capable of withstanding and why that knowledge was valuable to others facing similar challenges. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, I stood before the bathroom mirror in my restored master bedroom, holding a different kind of document in my hands. This time, it wasn't a medical report proving my sanity. It was a letter from the governor's office, informing me that I had been appointed to the State Commission on Elder Abuse Prevention. The appointment represented recognition not just of my personal experience, but of the expertise I had developed in understanding and combating the sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation that had nearly destroyed my life. The transformation from victim to advocate hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and purposeful. My home had become an informal headquarters for elder abuse prevention efforts, with a converted sunroom serving as my office where I maintained files on dozens of cases, corresponded with legislators about protective legislation, and prepared educational materials for distribution throughout the region. The irony wasn't lost on me that the room Marcus had once used to plot my exploitation was now dedicated to protecting others from similar predation. Justice, I had learned, sometimes comes in subtle forms of poetic reversal. My relationship with Patricia had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than it had been before the crisis. The shared trauma of discovering Marcus's betrayal had forced us to examine family dynamics we had previously taken for granted, leading to conversations about trust, vulnerability, and the complex responsibilities that come with loving, imperfect people. "Mom," Patricia said during one of our weekly dinners, "I've been thinking about how to explain Uncle Marcus to the boys when they're older. How do you help children understand that someone they loved was capable of such calculated cruelty? The question reflected her growth as a parent, and her recognition that protecting her children didn't mean shielding them from difficult truths about human nature. You tell them that people are complex, I replied, and that sometimes good people make terrible choices. You teach them to trust their instincts about when someone's behavior doesn't match their words, even if that someone is family. My work with the State Commission had introduced me to cases that dwarfed my own experience in scope and sophistication. I learned about financial exploitation schemes targeting hundreds of elderly victims, family members who had convinced entire communities that their relatives needed institutionalization, and healthcare professionals who had systematically over-medicated patients to maintain control over their decision-making capacity. Each case reinforced my understanding that Marcus's treatment of me hadn't been an aberration born of temporary desperation. It was part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior that targeted the elderly, because society was conditioned to accept their diminishing competence as natural and inevitable. The Commission's work led to significant legislative changes, including requirements for independent medical evaluations before guardianship proceedings, mandatory reporting protocols for financial institutions when suspicious patterns emerged in elderly customers' accounts, and criminal penalties specifically, targeting family members who exploited their access to vulnerable relatives. But perhaps more important than the policy changes was the cultural shift we were working to create. Through community education programs, media campaigns, and professional training initiatives, we were challenging the assumption that aging automatically meant declining competence and that family concern always represented genuine care rather than potential exploitation. Dr. Roswell had become both a colleague and a friend through our shared advocacy work. Her neurological expertise, combined with my lived experience of manipulation, created a powerful partnership for educating medical professionals about the intersection of cognitive assessment and elder abuse. "Margaret," she said, during one of our planning sessions for a medical conference presentation, "what you've accomplished is remarkable not just because you survived Marcus's manipulation, but because you've transformed that survival into protection for others. You've taken the worst experience of your life and made it meaningful." Her observation captured something I had been feeling but hadn't articulated, the sense that my suffering had gained purpose through helping others avoid similar victimization. The scared, confused woman who had questioned her own sanity hadn't disappeared. She had evolved into someone whose clarity about manipulation tactics and psychological resilience could serve as both warning and inspiration for others. My social life had expanded beyond what it had been even before Marcus's return. The book club had evolved into a broader discussion group that tackled not just literature, but current events, social issues, and community challenges. My advocacy work had connected me with people from different backgrounds and age groups who shared my commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Eleanor Hutchinson, my longtime walking partner, had become my closest collaborator in the community education efforts. Her steady presence during the darkest months of my manipulation had meant more than she probably realized, and working together on prevention programs had deepened our friendship into something that felt like chosen family. "Maggie," she said, as we concluded our morning walk through the neighborhood where I had once been seen as a declining elderly woman in need of supervision, "do you ever regret not signing those documents Marcus prepared? Do you wonder what would have happened if you had trusted his version of events?" The question prompted reflection on the path not taken, the alternative reality where I had accepted Marcus's narrative about my declining competence and surrendered control of my life to someone who claimed to be protecting my interests. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted. "But I realize now that signing those documents wouldn't have ended the manipulation. It would have institutionalized it. Marcus would have had legal authority to make decisions about my life, my living arrangements, my medical care. The psychological abuse would have continued, but with the backing of court-approved guardianship. The most unexpected development in my post-trial life had been the communication I received from other family members of elder abuse perpetrators, adult children whose siblings had exploited their parents, spouses who had discovered their partners were systematically manipulating elderly relatives, and even some perpetrators themselves who were seeking to understand and address their own abusive behaviors. These conversations were among the most difficult, but also most important aspects of my advocacy work. They reinforced my understanding that elder abuse often emerged from complex family dynamics, financial pressures, and personal failures that couldn't be addressed solely through criminal prosecution. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman whose brother had convinced their father to transfer his assets into a trust controlled by the son. Unlike my situation, the father in this case was indeed experiencing early-stage dementia, but the son had exploited and accelerated his confusion rather than protecting him from it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she wrote, "reading about your case helped me understand that my brother's behavior wasn't just misguided concern. It was calculated exploitation of our father's vulnerability. Your story gave me the courage to seek guardianship for Dad and get him the care he actually needs rather than the isolation my brother was providing." As I prepared for my latest speaking engagement, a presentation to a group of financial planners about recognizing signs of elder exploitation in their clients, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that December evening when I had first held Dr. Roswell's medical report proving my cognitive competence. The woman who had been targeted for her perceived vulnerability had become someone whose strength and clarity were sought out by others facing similar challenges. The isolated elderly person who had been convinced she needed supervision was now influencing policy at the state level and educating professionals throughout the region. My garden, which had suffered neglect during the months of Marcus's manipulation, was now more beautiful than it had ever been. The physical work of restoration had paralleled my psychological healing, and the successful flowering of plants I had nursed back to health served as daily reminders of resilience and renewal. The house that had nearly been stolen from me through fraudulent legal documents was now filled with the sounds of meaningful work, phone calls with other advocates, planning sessions for prevention programs, and visits from people seeking support and guidance. The sanctuary Robert and I had built together had been preserved not just as a personal refuge, but as a base for protecting others from similar violations. Standing in my study that evening, surrounded by case files and correspondence related to my advocacy work, I understood that while Marcus had tried to convince everyone I was disappearing into confusion and decline, what had actually happened was transformation and emergence. The greatest victory wasn't just that I had prevented his theft of my assets or proven my continued competence. It was that I had discovered reserves of strength and purpose I hadn't known I possessed. The teacher who had spent decades educating young people had found a new classroom and a more urgent curriculum. Marcus would be released from prison in 4 years. I had no illusions that he would emerge reformed or repentant. His behavior during the trial and afterward had shown a person fundamentally unable to accept responsibility for his choices. But I was no longer afraid of him or what he might attempt upon his release. The confused, isolated woman he had targeted no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood exactly how manipulation worked, who had built a network of professional and personal supporters, and who had legal documentation of both her competence and his predatory behavior. More importantly, I had become someone whose story served as both warning and inspiration for others facing similar betrayals. The personal trauma that had nearly destroyed me had been transformed into a tool for protecting an entire vulnerable population. As I turned off the lights in my study and prepared for bed in the master bedroom I had reclaimed from my son's occupation, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. The doctor's report that had changed everything 2 years ago had provided more than just proof of my cognitive health. It had given me back my voice, my agency, and ultimately, my calling. The truth had indeed changed everything. not by erasing the pain of betrayal, but by illuminating a path forward that led from victimization to advocacy, from isolation to community, and from fear to the kind of strength that can only come from surviving the worst and choosing to use that survival to protect others. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to ensure that other elderly people wouldn't face the systematic psychological destruction I had endured. The work was difficult and emotionally demanding, but it was mine to do, and I was exactly the right person to do it. The woman who had almost lost everything to someone she trusted completely had become someone who understood the true value of independence, competence, and the fierce protection of both in herself and others. That understanding, hard-won through months of manipulation and confusion, was now my most valuable asset, one that no one could steal, forge, or manipulate away from me. The story that had begun with a son's betrayal had become a testament to the possibility of reclaiming not just what was taken, but discovering what was always there, the unshakable core of self that survives even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.